Hey guys, welcome to another Friday video. Now this processor has been requested quite frequently. It is nothing other than the AMD FX-8350. This is a 8-core CPU from 2012 and back in the day it competed against the Intel Core i5. But what if you still have this processor and you're using it in 2020? Well, this is what we will find out today. I had a look at the launch reviews and the conclusion was that in heavily multi-threaded tasks the FX-8350 was quite competitive, but in single-threaded and lightly multi-threaded tasks the Intel processors were quite a bit faster. There's also a bit of controversy surrounding this CPU. It is marketed as having 8 cores, but it has 4 modules and within each module there are a few shared resources, especially the floating point unit. And it all came to a head with a lawsuit, and in the end AMD settled for around $12 million. So the FX-8350, we have 4 CPU modules or 8 CPU cores. We have 4 GHz base and 4.2 GHz turbo clock speed. This is a Black Edition CPU, so it's fully unlocked. It supports DDR3 memory, a TDP of 125 watts, and it launched in October of 2012 for a price of $195. In the past, we did have a look at some FX processors with 4 and 6 cores, and I got a lot of comments that, Phil, to really get decent performance out of these CPUs, you need to overclock, especially raising the frontside bus, and you also need to get some fast DDR3 memory. Now, overclocking is not something I'm good at. I don't do it too often, but for this processor, there's a huge following out there, and I think I would do this processor injustice if I didn't have a go at overclocking. So I went into the BIOS and disabled AMD C1E and C6 support, as well as virtualization and the AMD Cool and Quiet feature. And there's also an APM master mode, which I've disabled as well. In terms of overclocking, I wasn't aiming for the moon. We've got a 4.5 GHz clock speed for the CPU. The frontside bus runs at 250 MHz. The North Bridge frequency is 2.25 GHz. And the Hyper Transport Link runs at 2.5 GHz with the memory running at 2 GHz in dual channel configuration. So the mainboard I ended up using is from Gigabyte, the 990 FXA UD5. And I initially got this mainboard because it supports SLI and Windows XP. So it was quite handy for some retro SLI adventures. But of course, it also runs modern Windows 10 perfectly fine. We have 4 DDR3 memory slots, a heap of PCI Express slots to install video cards and other peripherals, and also 8 SATA ports. At the back we have a total of 8 USB 2, 2 USB 3. We've got Firewire, eSATA, there's an optical audio out, PS2, Gigabit Ethernet, and also audio ports. Although we're overclocking a little bit, I'm using a stock AMD cooler. This is the near silent 125 watt AMD thermal solution. And once again, we're using the IC graphite thermal pad. Worked fantastic for this project and just saves me from having to use thermal paste and cleaning up the mess. I should get some decent DDR3 memory, you guys told me. So, yep, I bought this kit on eBay. It's rated at 2133 MHz. It has 2 XMP profiles and was really easy to set up. Now, a little bit overkill for a machine from 2012 is the Radeon RX 5700 with 8 GB of video memory. But I wanted to make sure that we're not bottlenecked by the video card so we can really see what this CPU is capable of. For all the games, we're using once again a 2 TB SSD from Crucial. And you've also seen me use this power supply in most of my videos. It's a Thermaltake with 750 watts. We have some power readings sitting idle on the desktop, 123 watts, and running Cinebench R20, we're getting a reading of 213 watts. That's the entire system. And these figures are a little bit on the high side because of the manual overclock. I tested a wide range of games, but let's have a look at some benchmarks first. In Cinebench R15 we're getting 705, and in Cinebench R20 we're getting 1501. In Firestrike we're getting 11,653, as an overall score with a physics score of 8,623. And now let's have a look at some games. Let's start with Fortnite and Apex Legends. So Fortnite, we now running the DirectX 12 option, and look at that. It actually runs pretty well. In past videos I found that Fortnite was having a lot of frame time issues, but this is maybe because of the DirectX 12 option or because this processor has so many cores, it runs perfectly fine. And to get rid of some of the frame time issues, just activate a FPS cap. So here we have the game running at 60 FPS locked and seems to be running perfectly fine. Apex Legends also runs perfectly fine. This is a 1080p with all the details maxed out. I'm seeing excellent performance, over 100 FPS at times, and sometimes it even hits the 144 FPS cap of the engine. First, in the beginning, when you drop down, the FPS is a little bit lower, but the game is silky smooth and perfectly playable on this machine. I logged onto the Xbox Game Pass and I saw Mechwarrior 5, which seems to be a fairly recent game, so I downloaded that. We're running at 1080p with mostly high details, so if the option gave me high details, I selected that and I had everything else enabled, and I selected instant action. I don't know what I'm doing in this game, just walking around, but we're getting around 100 FPS, so that's also very good to see a modern game running well on this CPU. Now let's have a look at some games that are well optimized using the Vulkan API. Doom is a little bit older, but we can see at high details, 1080p, it runs well over 100 FPS, sometimes hitting the 200 FPS limit of the engine. Strange Brigade is another game using the Vulkan API. We've got high details and also well over 100 FPS. So that's another game that is really well playable. Now, Wolfenstein seems to have disappeared from the store, from the Xbox Pass, so I couldn't test that game anymore. But we have Rage 2. That game runs at 1080p high details, also perfectly playable thanks to the Vulkan API. And yeah, it's really nice to see all these games running perfectly fine on this old processor. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next. 1080p high details. We're getting over 60 FPS most of the time. I did see a few areas where it goes over 100 FPS even, and sometimes it does dip below 60, but that was not too often. So Shadow of the Tomb Raider with high details, if you have a decent video card, will run fine on the FX-8350. I did try the older game, Rise of the Tomb Raider, 1080p high details, silky smooth, although this is a scene at the beginning of the game, not very demanding, but both of these Tomb Raider games should be perfectly playable with this processor. Just Cause 4 surprised me. I know this is a demanding game. On the PlayStation 4, for example, the frame rate can drop really low. Now this is just the beginning of the game. I've set the details to high and we're getting over 60 FPS. So yeah, I was very surprised. Seems to be all these threads of the 8-core processor do a good job at handling this game. But like I said, this is only the beginning of the game, so it might become a lot more demanding later on. I tried Battlefield 5 with DirectX 11 option, 1080p high detail. This game seems playable, but it's not consistently running at 60 FPS. There will be dips below. So this is a game, competitive multiplayer game, that I probably would not recommend on this CPU. You might be able to tweak the settings a little bit more, maybe play with medium or low details, and maybe then it will run with more than 60 FPS. But it definitely runs a lot better on the FX-8350 compared to if you run this game on a Intel Core i5. So the 8350 definitely has aged better for games such as Battlefield 5. Far Cry 5 is next, a game from Ubisoft. This game runs better on Intel CPUs that have higher single-threaded performance, but it still runs fairly well, consistently over 30 FPS, and there's an option in the game to cap the FPS at 30, so you will get consistent frame times. And here we have Far Cry New Dawn, just under 60 FPS with high details. This is a little bit early in the game, there's not much going on here, so later in the game performance might be worse, but I expect this game also to be consistently above 30 FPS. F1 2018 runs smooth on this machine, high details 1080p, even at the beginning with all the cars around, which is usually the bottleneck with some older CPUs, we're getting decent performance in this game. And now let's have a look at two older classics. First we've got Half-Life 2, so that's all maxed out with I believe 4x anti-aliasing and 16x anisotropic filtering, and we're hitting the 300 FPS limit, so retro games perfectly playable on this machine. I also tested Dirt 3, this is always a game I check out at 1080p. Ultra details 4x AA, we're getting well over 100 FPS. So retro games and older games, you might have a huge Steam or GOG catalog with games that you've never played, they will run perfectly on this CPU. And finally, the most important question, does it run Crysis? Here we have the game running at 1080p with very high details. I got this version from GOG because there's no DRM, and yeah, it does a fairly decent job at running the game. Not 60 FPS locked, there are areas where it will dip below, but it's a fairly smooth experience. So guys, gaming on the FX-8350 in 2020, what is the verdict? Well, the outcome definitely surprised me. It did a lot better than I thought it would. Now, could be because we're using fast DDR3 memory, and of course we have a half decent overclock. So the advice you gave me is true. Give this machine good and fast DDR3 memory with low latencies and overclock by raising the frontside bus, and you will extract some decent performance out of this CPU. So if you bought such a platform in 2012 and you paid $195 for the CPU, you can still play a lot of games in 2020, and that is really what's amazing about this processor. Should you invest money in buying such a platform for retro PC gaming? I'm not sure. They say there's no such thing as a bad processor, only a bad price, so it boils down to what sort of price you're looking at. Unfortunately, the FX-8350, for some reason, the prices on the used market are really high. On AliExpress, the one around $100, which is a lot of money. Luckily, the processor has the latest CPU instructions, so modern games will run. But for $100, you can get a modern Ryzen CPU from AliExpress, so that's a little bit difficult. But if you bought one back in the day and you still got the machine, you might still have a few years left. Maybe some of the most modern games that are open world will struggle on such a machine, but there are a ton of games that will still run perfectly fine. So I think this is another example of AMD fine wine and AMD putting their money on a technology that's more future-proof. At the time, having so many cores didn't make a lot of sense for a lot of applications, maybe 3D rendering or video encoding, but for gaming, definitely at the time, it was the wrong move. You wanted less cores, but at a higher clock speed. But in 2020, things have changed. I can definitely tell you, if you bought an i5 processor in 2012, you will struggle in more games, whereas if you bought the FX-8350 and with a mild overclock and some decent memory, you can still hang in there, and most games will run perfectly fine on this 8-core CPU from 2012. Hopefully I did this processor justice. I have listened to your feedback and recommendations, and yes, I'm convinced this is really a fantastic CPU. If you bought it in 2012, the longevity and future-proofness is really confirmed. It still hangs in there with most modern games. So yeah, absolutely, I can see why this processor has such a following and so many fans out there. And hopefully you found this video interesting. As always, guys, leave a comment down below. What do you think about the FX-8350? Did you buy one in 2012, or did you put money with Intel? And as always, I do read every comment. You might not get a reply, but I do read every comment, and I pay close attention to feedback and constructive criticism for future videos. You never know everything with technology, it's just not possible, and I always learn something new from you guys, so keep up the comments. Give it a like, share the video with your friends, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Always something interesting to play around with. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I shall see you soon with another one.